Okay, so it is time for America in the 80s and 90s, which means it is time for Ronald Reagan, and that's where we're going to start today. Eventually, we'll be talking about Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton all in this one chapter, but today we're going to begin with a quick conversation about, oh my gosh, I need a cup of coffee. I'm so sorry. A quick conversation about liberals and conservatives, and then also Ronald Reagan's election, some of his domestic and foreign policies before we wrap up this part one. So our vocab for this topic, liberals, conservatives, moral majority, Reagan, supply side economics, all the way down to Glasnost, Perestroika, Iran-Contra, Brady Bill, Newt Gingrich, and the internet even. So we got a lot of diversity here. Describe the differences between liberal and conservative viewpoints, analyze the causes behind the conservative resurgence in the early 80s, explain why Ronald Reagan won the presidency in 1980, analyze Reagan's economic policies as president, examine Reagan's leadership and how he strengthened the conservative movement, evaluate the steps taken to address various issues in the 80s and 90s, analyze, isn't that a vague one there, analyze the ways that Ronald Reagan challenged communism in the Soviet Union, explain the end of the Cold War, describe other foreign policy challenges that faced the U.S. in the 80s, analyze why George H.W. Bush decided to use force in some foreign disputes and not in others, summarize the Persian Gulf War and its results, explain why Bill Clinton won the presidency in '92, assess the foreign policy goals and actions of the Clinton administration, describe U.S. relations with various Middle Eastern countries and groups, assess the success of Clinton's domestic policies, describe the contract with America and its impact, analyze the Clinton impeachment, and evaluate the changes that new technological innovations brought to the economy and daily life of the 90s. That would be the internet, right? So this is a very sad screenshot of a video I'm going to put in your folder, probably to introduce this topic. So hang tight on this. And let's start with this conversation about liberal versus conservative, because these are terms that we use today. They're a fairly new understanding in our country. You know, as long as you've been alive, we've had liberals and conservatives mean very distinct things. But the two major political parties in the late 20th century are Democrats and Republicans. So Democrats tend to be labeled as liberals, Republicans labeled as conservatives. In general, liberals favor government intervention. Government intervention, for example, to help the needy, whereas conservatives favor free market, private organizations would step in and not the government. So although the two parties do agree on many basic ideas, including core American values such as freedom and equality, they disagree or diverge, as it says, on many others. The donkey is the unofficial symbol of the Democratic Party or the liberal group, and the elephant is the unofficial symbol of the Republican Party or the conservative group. And at its heart, the debate over liberalism versus conservatism is about the size and role of government. What is government's job? Is it to help the poor, or is that, the role of private individuals? Is that the role of the church? Is it just to protect our country, or is it to also become more involved in domestic issues? So in general, liberals want a bigger government and conservatives want a smaller government. This is a chart for liberal views about certain issues, the role of government, the role of foreign policy, the role of healthcare. Healthcare is a right, and the role of energy, and this is really environmentalism to explore alternatives to to fossil fuels like oil. Oh my gosh, could not stop yawning. I promise I'm not that tired. During the 40s and 50s, the lines separating Republicans and Democrats had blurred. I mean, if I ask you, which party did Truman belong to? Which party did Eisenhower belong to? You may or may not remember, but you certainly would know which party Reagan belonged to, right? So the two parties in the 40s and 50s had developed a bipartisan and foreign policy aimed at containing communism. They were pretty much on the same page when it came to most things. They both favored a relatively significant role for the government in domestic affairs as well. However, during the 60s and 70s, many Republicans became increasingly critical of the liberal policies of Democrats. That's Kennedy. That's LBJ. They advanced a new conservative agenda. The differences between the two major parties grew more pronounced. The New Right, as the New Conservatives call themselves, grew rapidly and was a coalition of several different groups with varying degrees and goals. And I should also throw in Carter as one of those Democrats that people were frustrated with, right? This is an image from the 1980 National Convention, back when people could sit next to each other like that. And this is the election where Ronald Reagan wins and George H.W. Bush, the dad, will become vice president. Let's see, I mentioned most of this. Liberalism dominates in the 60s, but conservatives reemerge in the 70s and 80s. Yeah, I feel good about that. We also mentioned in the last topic about the growth of the Sun Belt. It's beginning to populate and play a larger political role because there's some infrastructure problems in the Northeast. They tend to vote conservative, and so as the population of the Sun Belt grows, conservatism will necessarily grow with it. White Southerners have concerns about the civil rights being promoted by liberals. Westerners are concerned about environmental regulations being promoted by liberals. And as more and more people move to the suburbs, there's an increase in concern about taxes. And if you are a liberal who favors big government, then you favor more taxes. And so Republicans tended to run on that messaging. You also have the growth of the religious right. As society becomes more morally permissive, it makes sense that you will have a segment of the society that wants to stay morally conservative, and that's where that term moral majority comes from. They say, look, most of the country isn't ready for abortion rights, isn't ready for the Equal Rights Amendment, doesn't like all these hippies from the 60s, right? And we need to maintain our more traditional values. This is also the era of the rise of the televangelists, these television preachers. That's Billy Graham on the left, who's a very well-known Protestant evangelical. And then at the bottom there, that's Pat Robertson on the left, a televangelist, Jerry Falwell on the right. They are the founders of the Moral Majority, which is a political group aimed at encouraging Christian conservatives to act on those Christian conservative beliefs politically and vote Republican. We're going to come back to these economic issues. So the growing conservative movement swept the Republican presidential candidate Ronald Reagan to victory in the 1980 election, much more charismatic and polished than Goldwater, who is his Democratic opponent. Reagan made clear his opposition to big government, his support for a strong military, and his faith in traditional values. Just as importantly, he radiated optimism, convincing Americans that he would usher in a new era of prosperity and patriotism. This is a photo of him from 1951. He was a movie star. After that, he was a two-term governor of California. He is incredibly charismatic. He knew how to speak. In fact, his nickname was the Great Communicator. And so all those things really combine to move him pretty effortlessly into 2 terms as president. This is a video, the top right there. I'm going to put that in your folder for you to watch. He does promise to cut taxes, increase defense spending. He wants to ban abortion with an amendment. That never happens, of course. But those are some of his goals. He was well known for saying, government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem. Speed through that. Conservatives celebrate Ronald Reagan's election as the fulfillment of their dreams. Some even refer to his coming to power as the, quote, Reagan Revolution. Even to this day, you will hear a lot of people refer to themselves as Reagan Republicans, meaning they joined the Republican Party because of Ronald Reagan. The Reagan Revolution would bring significant shift in the political direction of the nation. Let's see here, Reaganomics. So this is his economic plan. Remember, Carter had ushered in this era of, not ushered in, I shouldn't have said that. Carter has to deal with stagflation. He's pretty unsuccessful with it, and so there's a lot of pressure on Reagan's economic plan. The 4 pillars of Reaganomics: to reduce the growth of government spending, to reduce federal income tax and capital gains tax, to reduce government regulation, and to control the monetary supply in order to control inflation. And if I go quickly back here, if you remember how high inflation was when he takes office. Um, let's see if there's anything else I want to mention from here. Reagan also uses supply-side economics to combat this issue of stagflation. Remember, high interest rates, a tax cut. Supply-side economics is trickle-down economics. The idea is that if you cut taxes for the wealthy, if you make life easier for businessmen, that the wealth that the people at the top accrue will eventually trickle down to everyone else. Lowering taxes, though, creates a deficit. Reagan has to choose, do I deficit spend or do I pull money from somewhere else? And Reagan wants to cut social programs, but military spending won't allow for a balanced budget, and the decision is that debt is okay. So while Reagan spends some time preaching, advocating for a balanced budget, in the end, he decides that it is okay to deficit spend for the reason that he's deficit spending, which we'll come back to in just a minute. But I'm going to let this guy who's annoying, but he's one of those teachers that has a YouTube channel. He's got an annoying voice, but he's going to explain to us a little bit more about supply-side economics. Mercifully, it's pretty short.
Hey guys, welcome to Hip Use History. We're going to bang out some content for you guys. Supply-side economics, also called trickle-down economics. It's going to be on the exam. And if it's not on the exam, it's going to pop up in an awkward situation that we don't want you to look like an idiot. So giddy up for the learning, guys. Trickle-down economics. Give me like 3 minutes, and I'll grow your brain. All right, we're going to preface this by saying that I'm not advocating for this economic position, nor am I trying to disparage it. We're just trying to explain it. And if you've taken United States history up to this point in the 1980s, we're going to associate trickle-down economics with Ronald Reagan, Republicanism, George Bush, those dudes. You've already learned of kind of the opposite theory. The opposite theory is called Keynesian economics. Sometimes I'll call it pump spending. The idea that you need to have the federal government help create jobs for the poor or give some type of economic incentives to the poor, and then they'll spend that money and it kind of rises the balloon. You kind of pump the air into the bottom of the balloon and then the whole balloon rises. Well, the opposite theory is called trickle-down economics, and rather than a hot air balloon or pumping air, we're going to think of the United States as getting hungry, an ice cream cone. How about that? Look at the nice ice cream cone. And the idea is that, first of all, you want to help the whole ice cream. Both of these economic theories argue that this is the best thing for everybody in the economy. But in the ice cream cone, on the top of the ice cream, you would have kind of the elite, the upper class. Maybe Bill Gates is the cherry on top. And on the bottom of the ice cream, you kind of have the millions of toiling, kind of lower classes. And the idea is, in order to stimulate the economy, you need to take tax cuts or economic subsidies or some type of, cashola and pour it on top of the ice cream. And then when you give that money back to the people who you took it from the first place, that's the argument, because they pay the highest taxes, that they're going to use that money better than the government could use it. They're going to use it to expand the factory, to give more wages to their workers, to create more product. And that, in a sense, is job creation. That's the trickle-down effect. So the guy that's on the bottom of the ice cream that's looking for a job and he doesn't have opportunity now can taste that chocolate sauce dripping down the ice cream cone. And this is also called supply-side economics, that you are, in a sense, helping the supply side rather than the demand side. But either way, that's trickle-down economics. So the next time on a test you see Ronald Reagan or George Bush, I want you to see a big fat ice cream cone. And then your brain will hopefully race to supply-side economics. So there you go, guys. Remember, the opposite, that's a different lecture, is called Keynesian economics or pump spending. That would be the FDR or the Lyndon Johnson idea. So there you go.
Okay. So let's compare those two ideas that he was talking about, supply side and Keynesian or pump spending. If the problem is an economic recession, that consumer demand for goods and services has decreased, that the nation's factories and businesses have reduced their output, and that the result is an overall slowing of the economy. The Keynesian, the FDR, the LBJ answer is the government needs to increase spending on goods and services in order to increase demand and encourage economic output by factories and businesses. The supply side would say the government needs to cut taxes. That will encourage consumer spending as well as consumer saving and investment. Savings and investment are borrowed by creative entrepreneurs to grow their companies by creating new products and services. The goal for both is an economic recovery. It has mixed results. There are people who are huge fans of supply side and people who are huge fans of Keynesian. It just sort of depends on what your economic preference is as an economist. I just think this picture looks so fake, but I mean, it's not. It's just a foggy background. This is Reagan signing tax and budget cuts as he vacations in 1981. Despite budget and debt problems, the economic recovery improved the national mood. It helped Ronald Reagan's popularity. Reagan used his time in office to strengthen the conservative cause. Private conservative educational and research groups, such as Washington, D.C.'s Heritage Foundation, supported Reagan and lobbied Congress on behalf of his programs. The economy starts to recover. Reagan will win election. Actually, before I get to this, I want to back up for 1 second. I want to mention also that Reagan is shot in 1981. There is an assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan by a man who is deemed afterwards to be legally insane, arrested and committed. But he shot Reagan in an effort to get the attention of and to impress the actress Jodie Foster. You know Jodie Foster. He doesn't realize he's been shot until he's halfway back to the White House, having been whisked away by Secret Service, and he sort of lifts up his shirt and sees that he's wounded. And they take him to the hospital. As he's going into surgery, he famously says, "I hope you're all Republicans." And then after having recovered, he's giving a speech somewhere, and a balloon pops, and it sounds like a gunshot. And he sort of, you can tell he's a little startled. Everyone in the room is freaked out, and he says, "You missed me," which, you know, Reagan was kind of a funny guy. But he was shot. One of his bodyguards was paralyzed, which leads to the passage of some gun legislation that is important in your textbook as well. The economy is going to begin to recover. Reagan wins re-election in 1984. He will beat the Democratic challengers Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro, who is the first female vice president nominee. The Supreme Court will be Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female in 1981, William Rehnquist, Antonin Scalia, who recently died, and Anthony Kennedy. There was some pressure for him to nominate Robert Bork, who Nixon had employed to fire the special prosecutor, but that was ultimately rejected. Despite Reagan's vision of his campaign slogan, "It's morning in America," he would say, and Bush's 1,000 points of light, in truth, a great cultural and economic divide existed in 1980s society, a division partially defined by race, ethnicity, and gender. The economic recovery of the mid-'80s did not affect all segments of society equally. As the number of poor increased, so did violence and drug use in the nation's inner cities, and at the same time, a culture of acquisition intensified among Americans. Y'all brace yourself for this photo. Look at this phone. Look at this woman. She's a yuppie, it says, a young urban professional or a yuppie. Speaks on an early model of a cell phone in 1983. That was the year I was born. Don't work too hard to do the math on that. But there she is, talking on her phone. Look at that antenna. She had to pull it all the way up. Yes, there's her briefcase. I like it. All right, to be continued. Talk about George H.W. Bush